The 2030 Agenda has attracted a lot of attention from the private sector, and it seems that all of the large companies are now talking about the SDGs. I would argue that this is partly because the SDGs in many ways build on frameworks that are more familiar to the private sector than what we've seen with previous development agendas such as the MDGs. And in this brief lecture, I'll discuss some of these concepts from theories of corporate social responsibility and look into how they perhaps align better with the SDGs. So, in the 1960s, Nobel Prize winner in economics Milton Friedman famously proclaimed that the business of business is business. By this, he meant that a company's responsibility towards society was strictly economic and related to creating jobs, paying taxes, and creating revenues for its shareholders. However, over the past decades, there has been an increasing recognition of the detrimental consequences that harmful corporate practices can have, both on natural environments and societies. And this, for instance, through industrial pollution, resource depletion, human rights violations, and many other issues. As such, expectations towards companies have also widened in that a company's responsibility to society extends beyond their economic contributions, and that social and environmental dimensions must also be managed in a responsible way. And this is the essence of what is often referred to as CSR, or corporate social responsibility, and many related concepts such as environment, social, and governance, or ESG, or a term that is more frequently being used these days, corporate sustainability. Much of this thinking is rooted in the concept of the triple bottom line, which is a term that was coined by Elkington in the 1990s. As you can see, this is aligned with the three pillars of sustainability and the same dimensions that are identified in the SDGs. So in CSR, this is also often referred to as the three Ps. People representing the social dimension, planet representing the environmental dimension, and profit representing the economic dimension. In triple bottom line thinking, the idea is that for a company to truly assess the full cost of their business, they need to take an integrated approach to the social, environmental, and economic dimensions of their business operations. So, how can corporate social responsibility be defined? In a European Union definition from 2001, it is claimed that CSR is a concept whereby companies integrate social and environmental concerns in their business operations and in their interaction with their stakeholders on a voluntary basis. And stakeholder is a key term in CSR literature. And it means all of those who are actually affected by the business operations. And the stakeholder theory was popularized by Edward Freeman in 1984, who argued that for-profit activities have a much wider reach than simply its shareholders, and they also affect a large number of stakeholders in society. So this relates not only to the internal stakeholders, such as employees and those who work in the supply chains, but also externally, such as the general public, civil society, governments, NGOs. And the definition of stakeholders has also been widening, and many now even include the natural environment and climate as stakeholders. So the point of this theory is that it recognizes that a company's survival is not solely dependent on pleasing its shareholders, but also other actors that are affected by business. And there are various justifications for why companies should engage with CSR, and one could also say that the weighting of these justifications have shifted through time. But Werther and Chandler offer an explanation of some of the core arguments for corporate engagement with CSR. And the first one is the moral argument. The main point here is that since a company does not operate in a vacuum, but rather is dependent on the society in which it operates, it needs to operate in a way that society finds responsible and beneficial. So here, profit is not really seen as the ultimate goal for a corporation, but rather as means to achieve a greater good. A second argument is the rational one, where CSR is seen as a way for companies to manage risks and increase legitimacy. Through recognizing and engaging with not only the shareholders of the company, but also the stakeholders, such as suppliers, customers, and regulatory bodies, companies can better anticipate and reflect societal concerns and minimize operational costs to their business. Then there is the third argument for CSR, which is economic self-interest, often portrayed as the business case for CSR, which is a narrative that we know well from the SDGs. In recent years, the potential of CSR as a strategic resource has been increasingly recognized. And by using CSR as a strategic tool, it can help a company, it is argued, to not only retain social legitimacy and reduce risks, but also help identify business opportunities and be a potent source of competitive advantage. Research has also demonstrated positive linkages between corporate financial performance and CSR. And the majority of the world business leaders now believe that commitment to sustainability benefits their company's economic performance. So many have been skeptical of the concept of CSR, both on a systemic but also on an operational level. But the growing business case for CSR has led many companies to engage more actively with sustainability issues. And this is also evident through the warm embrace of business of the SDGs. While there are vast examples of greenwashing and disparities between talk and action, there is increasing understanding also in the private sector that corporate social responsibility should not really be about offsetting harmful impacts on society, but rather about eliminating these harmful impacts in the first place and making sure that the whole business is sustainable and beneficial to society. This is often referred to as creating shared value. And examples of this can be seen, for instance, through the rise of social entrepreneurship or B corporations, where companies are actively working to solve global and local challenges through their business operations. In much of the early CSR discourse, emphasis was placed on the responsibility of companies to avoid causing harm. And we saw this also in the previous European Union definition that we saw, where the emphasis was on engaging with stakeholders to reflect social and environmental concerns. We have, however, seen a shift, also illustrated in the 2030 Agenda, where the private sector is actively engaged in the development agenda, where companies are increasingly being called upon to go beyond just limiting their harmful impacts, but also called upon to maximize their positive impacts, for instance, through providing innovative solutions to challenges. And the European Union in 2011 came out with a new definition of CSR, which is a wider version, where CSR is simply defined as the responsibility of enterprises for their impacts on society. So we see that this also opens up for any impacts, both negative and positive, that corporate practices have. So CSR builds on the pillars of sustainability, which we can also recognize from the SDGs, namely the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. The triple bottom line approach, like the SDGs, underlines the holistic nature of sustainability and that all dimensions are connected and must be dealt with in an integrated way. I would argue that this is part of why companies have taken to the SDGs and adopted many of its priorities. There is no doubt that the private sector, with its technical, human, and not least financial resources, will be very important to address the massive challenges that are identified in the 2030 Agenda. But many are, of course, questioning corporate commitments to sustainability and the role that business can and actually will play in advancing this agenda. I discussed those issues further in another lecture, but I hope that this very brief lecture has helped shed some more light on how some concepts from CSR theory resonates and aligns with some of the SDG rhetoric.